I'm very happy to be here. That's my second visit to the Eurocloud Forum. I had an opportunity to take part in the Eurocloud Forum some years ago in Luxembourg. That was the time when I was the National Commissioner for Data Protection in my country of origin, in Poland. And since we were dealing with the problems of cloud computing from the very beginning, and I also dealt with it in my scientific activity as the professor in the University of Gdansk, I was always very interested in the subject. This time I come here as the representative of the European Data Protection Supervisor. I'm a deputy supervisor. The European Data Protection Supervisor is Giovanni Buttarelli from Italy, and I've been elected together with him in order to be the data protection authority of the European Union institutions. What I'm going to present you today in this short presentation, I will try to do it in 20-25 minutes in order to leave some time for the discussion, but we will also take part in the panel right after that. What I'm going to present are actually two parts of the subject. The general things that you should be aware and which are dealing with mostly with the problem of cooperation between data protection authorities and the steps that we are going to take in order to prepare the legal background and the practical background for the implementation of the General Data Protection Regulation. And the second part will be more focused on the typical cloud issues and the recent developments as far as both self-regulatory and regulatory issues are concerned. But let me start, as I usually start the presentations like that, ladies and gentlemen, dear data subjects. We are talking about something which is not a commodity. This is not something that we found in the coal mine, and these are not someone's data which are stored on someone's servers somewhere in the world. This is an information about us. This is information about our behavior. This is the information about our personal life, the personal life of us, our friends, families, clients, customers, friends, and probably also enemies. So we have to be aware that this is the data that I'm going to talk about today, the personal data, is a special kind of thing, a special kind of data that we are dealing with and that we have to take in our consideration. As I said, European Data Protection Supervisor is the institution which is supervising the European institutions, bodies and agencies, and I would like to make it very clear that as far as the cooperation between the data protection authorities and the hierarchy, let's say, of the data protection authorities, there is no significant change from what happened before the General Data Protection Regulation. There is nothing like all European agency dealing with the data protection. There is nothing like all the European institution that is above the data protection authorities in the countries. We still have 28 data protection authorities on the national level in 28 countries, plus the 29th, which is EDPS, which is European Data Protection Supervisor, who is supervising the institutions, bodies and agencies of the European Union. We have here with us today the Romanian Data Protection Authority. The Commissioner is with us at this presentation, and she is definitely the one who is the most important person as far as the data protection activities are concerned in Romania. While EDPS is, first of all, as I said, the supervisor of the institutions. Secondly, we are going to provide the secretariat for so-called European Data Protection Board. For most of you, that's the name that you already heard. For those for whom that's the new name, the European Data Protection Board is the successor of so-called Working Party of Article 29. The Working Party of Article 29 right now is gathering all the data protection authorities from European Union countries, and it will be, as I said, succeeded by the European Data Protection Board, which will be a little bit more organized body, I may say. It will have the legal authority, it will have the legal position, it will be able sometimes to issue binding decisions. decisions which are binding also in the practical individual cases. But that will be an exception from the general rule where the data protection authority of the country is the one that is the most important. Sorry for starting from this very organizational thing, but there is sometimes a kind of misunderstanding. So I'm not supervising the DPAs in the countries. That is still the collective activity of the data protection authorities. Moreover, and this is something that Václav was talking about a while ago as well, there are the data protection authorities in the other countries of the world. Right now there is 109 countries in the world who have data protection regulation of different kinds. Some of them are very similar to what we have in the European Union. That's how it is in Switzerland, in Norway for obvious reasons, or in Serbia for obvious reasons. But also if we compare the authority in New Zealand, in Australia, a Canadian authority, they are very similar to the one that we have in Europe. Also Japanese authority you will find very similar. In the other fields, these differences might be, in the other countries the differences might be bigger. For example, there is a data protection authority in the United States. There is somebody who is a data protection authority. That's the Federal Trade Commission. And as long as the supervision of the market is concerned, it's the same data protection authority as it is in the other countries of the world. They do not have the supervision over the public bodies, and that's the difference. So the difference is they do not supervise the administration of the United States, but they do so with the market. So we have the cooperation also on international level, and we are going to meet all the data protection authorities next month in Marrakesh in Morocco at the International Conference of Data Protection Authorities. The objectives of the European Data Protection Supervisor includes the things which are important for us today. First of all, this point number 3, opening the new chapter of the EU data protection, is of course the subject of today's meeting. But also the fact that the data protection goes digital. That's one of our main messages for the future. Not that the data goes digital, because data went digital 30 years ago. And there is no better place to talk about it than the Eurocloud Forum. But what we want to stress is that the legal protection of the data is definitely not enough in the 21st century. Actually, half of the job is the job which is either organizational or technical. And without the technical development in this field, without the good synergy between the security protection and the data personal data protection, will not have the system which will be really operational. And the same applies to the organizational measures. So this is not only data protection law, and once again there is no better place to say about it, because you are more aware of that than anybody in the world. What we have to say about the GDPR, about the General Data Protection Regulation, is a kind of shift that we can see from the pure compliance approach to something which is more an accountability approach. Instead of dealing with notifications on what's going on, we are trying to apply the system where the entities who are dealing with the data will be able to be accountable of their activities. Meaning will be able to keep the principles and being able to present the way they keep it. The way they keep it not by prior consultations, not by any kind of notifications, but of being themselves organizationally prepared for the subject. So that's why more focus is given right now to the data protection impact assessments that are done by the companies and the entities themselves, than to the normal notification procedures that existed under the old directive. Well, the rules seem to be the same, or seem to be very similar to what we have in the past. The data has to be lawfully, fairly, and transparently managed. It has to be limited to the purposes for which it was gathered. And that's one of the points when we have the first big clash as far as the big data environment is concerned. So the mere idea of the big data is a reuse of the data. While we have to say that the data protection authorities and those who are dealing with the data protection are trying to focus on the data, on the purpose limitation principles and data minimization principle. So as less data as possible and used for the purposes for which it was gathering. Although I hear the voices from the market who say completely opposite things. There is a representative of one of the big companies dealing with the cloud as well, who says data minimization is the biggest crime against humanity that we do at the moment, because we will need this data in the future. Well, I disagree with it, but I hear this voice. That's an important point. That's the point in which definitely the discussion is going to be done. The data has to be accurate, and of course the storage limitation, meaning also the retention period, is something to be taken into consideration, and integrity and confidentiality of the data, which is one of the main subjects that you are discussing during this meeting, is something that we observe at the same time. And each and every entity who is the controller and sometimes also the processors have to be accountable for that, have to be able to show that they are observing these principles. So, of course, it comes from the Charter of Rights of the European Union. Of course, it comes from the Treaty of the European Union functioning. But as I said, the roots of these ideas are much farther. Now I try to make it working again. Okay, are much farther because there are much more places where the protection looks very similar. Here you have the countries of the Council of Europe who are working on the changes of the convention which is dealing with the data protection in it. But we are staying in the European Union, we are staying with the cooperation of the data protection authorities. As I said before, we are creating the European Data Protection Board. What is extremely important for the cloud computing market is the fact that apart from being the coordination body of the data protection authorities, apart from issuing decisions in some exceptional cases, the European Data Protection Board will be able to issue guidelines on how to interpret the GDPR. Formally speaking, these guidelines are not binding. So theoretically, this is not the law. This is not even a typical soft law. This is guidance. But I have to say that both on the side of the data protection authorities and especially on the side of the market, there is a big expectations toward this kind of guidelines. And then the first thing that you have to be aware is the fact that European Data Protection Board is not able to create any kind of guidelines before it starts to exist. And it will start to exist on 25th of May 2018. So from the very formal point of view, I would have to say that there will be no guidance from the European Data Protection Board before May 2018, because they simply cannot do it from the legal point of view. But of course, there is also good news. The good news is the working party of Article 29 is right now working on this matter and working on this guidance as well, in order to be prepared for the day one. Of course, formally speaking, working party of Article 29 cannot prepare the document, which is the document of EDPB, because that will be another body. But bearing in mind that the composition of the EDPB and the composition of the working party of Article 29 is exactly the same, what we plan to do is to prepare the documents that will be able to be passed by the European Data Protection Board on the very first day of its existence. So there is even a plan to organize the first meeting of the European Data Protection Board on 25th of May 2018, the day after the last meeting of the Working Party of Article 29, and to start with the new documents and opinion from this very first day. So this is the good story in the bad one, where the bad one is that we shouldn't expect an official guidance before the 25th of May 2018, but as I said, this work has already been started. That is sometimes called the Copernican revolution in the data protection. Well, as a person who comes from the city, which is just 50 kilometers from the place where Copernicus lived, I can tell you this is not the Copernican revolution. The Copernicus has removed the sun from the middle of the universe and removed the earth from the middle of the universe and put the sun there. While in the whole reform of the data protection law, there is still the person, the data subject, the human who is in the middle and who is in the center of gravity. So everything is around the human dignity anyway. But as I said, the changes are significant. The data protection regulation, the GDPR, and the directive which is dealing with the data protection in the law enforcement sector has changed several things. Hello, work. First of all, that will be definitely directly binding, directly effective, directly applicable, horizontally and vertically all over Europe. But there will be some exceptions. Fortunately, in the subjects which are the most important for cloud computing services, the exceptions are very limited. But that's true that some parts of the regulation looks a little bit like directive, especially when it goes to the labor law, for example. So some of your companies may struggle with this fact that there is still some possibilities for the national states to create their own law, which is left in the General Data Protection Regulation. But instead of fixing on sensitive data, fixing on specific subjects, we rather try to focus on different kind of risky processing and different kind of assessment of the risk and assessment of the activities that are done by the entities. So, privacy impact assessment, privacy by design, and accountability are definitely the words to remember. One more myth that is around the GDPR and which I would like to fight with because it's important for the cloud computing industry. There is no change of the definition of the personal data. There is a myth that the definition that is in GDPR is much broader than the one that we had so far. This is simply not true. What has happened is the change of the environment, not the change of law. The definition is actually staying the same. While this is true, that it's much easier to find this quantum of the data that makes something which was not the personal data so far, personal in the future. And this is something that the cloud services are struggling with, and the whole world of big data is struggling with. The second thing which did not change is the definition of the controller and the definition of the processor. Of course, there was no definition of the processor in the directive, but right now it appears, but the definition of the processor was built on what was in the directive. That's important because the clouds of conduct, which I will talk about in a while, often refers to the problem of controller and the problem of processor. Controller is the one who decides about the means to process the data and about the purposes for which the data is processed. while the processor is always working in the name of the controller. And although GDPR includes a lot of rules for the processor, definitely the controller is the one who is the most important. One of the attitudes which is well visible in the documents which are prepared by the market of the cloud service providers is a kind of shift to present the cloud service providers as processors and leaving the controllers, the customers, as the controllers. Which is often true, I agree, especially if we think about infrastructure as a service. But it is not true once we go to the more sophisticated ways of dealing with the cloud computing services. And in most of, especially software as a service solutions, it's very hard to say that the cloud service provider is just the processor, while the customer is always the controller. Well, in the typical IaaS solution, it really looks like that the service provider is simply giving an infrastructure and all operations are done by the controller, and the service provider is actually sometimes not even is not even certain what's going on in, and definitely is not deciding neither on processes, on purposes, nor on means. But in SaaS, it's much different, especially if the customer is the small, medium company, which is not an IT company. Then usually this person, this entity, is actually hiring at the same time the infrastructure and the service from the service provider, and the software from the service provider, while this is only the creator of the software or the manager of the software who is actually able to say what the software really does. What is the purpose for that is something that most probably the customer has quite a lot of to say. But if you think about what are the means to process the data, it's not true anymore. And a very good example for that is this doctor of medicine who is going to have the database of his patients on his computer. He doesn't have it on his computer, he's just hiring a software as a service solution in order to have the software, to have the infrastructure, to have the place to store the data, to have the accessibility to that in each and every moment. If so, if it's done this way, then usually the doctor of medicine has no clue. Sorry? Closer, okay. The doctor of medicine has no clue how actually the data is processed. He knows what purposes should be achieved, but it's hard to say that he is the one who is controlling the means. So, once again, there is a distinction between controller and processor. In many cases, the cloud providers and cloud service providers are actually only the processors, but this is not true in all the situations, and it is not true in most of the situations. And as I said, some of the codes of conduct start to pretend or limit their scope to those situations where the cloud service provider is the processor. What are the concerns of the data protection authorities as far as cloud services are concerned? Well, first of all, that this is still the development in progress, and still the terminology is developing. Quite a lot was done last year, especially in the processes that were done both by business and by the European Union on a kind of standardization of the solutions that exist, or rather the comparison of different schemes of standardization, but still the kind of problem with the definitions exists. Data processing becomes global. Data processing definitely loses the borderlines, which Václav was also talking about. Transparency is the main issue, but once again, that's something that we can see in the codes of conduct that are prepared by the business. And there is still a pressing need both on reducing costs on the side of consumer, on the other hand, to increase the accessibility of the data on the side of the consumers. You know the strategy that the EU has prepared. You know some activities that was done by the European Union last years. What I would like to focus on in the last 2 minutes of my presentation are the current deliverables. Inside this work on the strategy, the cloud computing business has taken part in preparation of the Cloud Select Industry Group certification schemes and Cloud Service Industry Group Code of Conduct. This Code of Conduct has been presented to the Working Party of Article 29, and the Working Party of Article 29 has also prepared its answer to the code itself. Data protection authorities has also issued the document which is called the support memorandum. That's that was created by so-called Berlin Group, the International Working Group on Data Protection in Telecommunication, which is much broader than EU. This is also USA, this is also Korea, this is also Canada, and it started to list the questions that are usually asked. And the very recent development that I would drive your attention to, I don't know how many of you is aware of that, is the fact that in September this year, actually on 26th of September this year, the group of the data of the cloud service providers has issued the Code of Conduct for Cloud Infrastructure Service Providers. That seems to be a very good and interesting document with two limitations. The first, it's of course infrastructure as a service that is taken into consideration. And secondly, with this division that I was talking about. So the cloud service providers are taken only as processors. And as long as this is true, as long as we are in EIS, as long as we have the cloud service provider as a processor, it is a very interesting document. The only problem is that there are less and less situations where the division is so simple. So I would like to assure you that the data protection authorities are really open for all kinds of codes of conducts and self-regulatory solutions prepared by the market, but don't find the ones that were prepared so far as the golden bullets that solve all the problems. And the last message, the same is with certification. Certification is definitely the future for the cloud services and also for the data protection assessment in the cloud services, with two limitations once again. The different thing is to certify the process, and the different thing is to certify the entity. So even if we have the company which tries to show that their products meet the requirements of the data protection law, it's much easier to make the certification of the product or service than the company as a whole. Moreover, if we say product or a service, of course it's easier for the product than for the service. Because the second limitation of the certification is that the certification always concerns the date. So it's always for today, or the day when the assessment was done. Which means that if the service develops the day after, and it is developing, the certification maybe it's not is gone, but can be questioned. So certification is the future, but it's for many data protection authorities the new thing, and they are anyway aware of the fact that first of all they cannot certificate themselves because they do not have resources for that, so they have to accredit the institutions that will make certification. Secondly, certification is certification of product or service rather than the certification of the entity. And finally, the certification is for the date the assessment was done. Well, I hope we will treat it as the introduction to the discussion that will be taken on also during the panel, but I'm ready to answer your questions if there are any.